My name is Don Marr. I'm the chair of the economics department. I welcome you for braving the weather, coming on a Friday evening to hear enlightening lecture about economics. Couple things. I just wanted to say something about Dr. Betty J. Blecko. Betty Blecko was a remarkable professor here at San Francisco State University from about 1983 to 2012. And she had this belief that San Francisco State was a special place, but she also believed that San Francisco State people should be exposed to world-class people, world-class thoughts, and world-class lectures. And so she endowed this series of lectures, which we've had, this is the second Betty J. Blecko Memorial Lecture. So we're very pleased to offer these lectures to the general audience. Just a couple other things about Dr. Blecko. She was actually a very multi-talented individual. She was a world-class photographer. She did artist in residence at the Grand Canyon National Park. And she had a variety of interests, and I will just leave you with this one thought about Dr. Blecko, and that she would have been very happy as a Bob Dylan fan at the current Nobel Prize for Literature. Anyway, I will turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Venu Kakar, who will introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Venu Kakar, and I'm an assistant professor of economics here at San Francisco State University. On behalf of the economics department, I'd like to welcome you all to this event on the highly topical theme of improving equality of opportunity in America, new lessons from big data. This is a theme that has been very close to our hearts here at SF State, where we strive for upward mobility. But I'm very pleased to see the turnout on a Friday evening, which we were very concerned when we were planning this event. Would it be successful? But thank you all for making this possible. We're delighted to have with us, beyond the San Francisco State University community, students and faculty from UC Berkeley, Mills College, University of San Francisco, Diablo Valley College, and California State University, East Bay. We also have two very important people in the audience with us today, President Wong and Mrs. Wong. Thank you for coming and supporting this event despite your very busy schedule. In just a moment, I will introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Rod Chetty. After his presentation of about an hour, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. There are two mics on the floor, one here, one on my left, and Dr. Michael Barr and myself will be helping you out. I also would like to mention that we are video recording this event, and this will be made available on the SF State YouTube channel. And finally, I'd like to turn over the slide for some fun trivia. So what do Professor Chetty and this person have in common? And I'd like to ask you guys if you know, and you can shout. Harvard, excellent. August 4th, excellent. It is true, President Obama and Professor Chetty both went to Harvard University. The president, of course, to study law, and Professor Chetty to study economics. They both share their birthday as well, like you said. They were born on August 4th. However, Professor Chetty happens to be a lot younger than our president. Finally, they both work extremely hard to improve the equality of opportunity in America. Professor Chetty mostly on the research side, and President Obama on the policy side. Professor Chetty's work on education was cited by President Obama in the State of the Union address in 2012. In the research that our president cited, Professor Chetty found that high value-added teachers can boost the long-run earnings of their kindergarten students. But it is to Professor Chetty's work and to his credit that we now know that there are huge variations in rates of upward mobility across the United States. Professor Chetty is one of the top scholars and prolific researchers in the world. He's a professor of economics at Stanford University, co-director of the Public Economics Group at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has been named one of the top economists in the world by the New York Times and The Economist magazine. Dr. Chetty received his PhD from Harvard University in 2003 at the remarkably young age of 23 and became an assistant professor at UC Berkeley right after that. So I will let you guess how old or young he is. He returned to Harvard University in 2009 as one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history and then moved to Stanford in 2015. He has won many accolades for his accomplishments. He was awarded the MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 2012 and is one of the youngest recipients of the John Bates Clark Medal given by the American Economic Association to the best American economist under age 40. This is extremely prestigious since 40% of economists who win the John Bates Clark Medal go on to win the Nobel Prize in the economic sciences. No pressure here. He was also awarded the Padma Shri, one of the highest civilian awards for distinguished service in any field by the Government of India in 2015. His work on tax policy, unemployment, education, and social mobility has been widely cited in the media and congressional testimony. His articles have appeared in top-rated economics journals, such as the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the American Economic Review, and Econometrica, among others. In short, tonight's going to be spectacular, so it is with great honor that I request you all to join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Raj Chetty.
And do it to PowerPoint. Double click. There you go.
Thank you so much for the very warm introduction, Venu. It's really a pleasure to be here at San Francisco State. Thank you all for coming out this evening. So I'm going to talk this evening about improving equality of opportunity in America. And I'm going to focus specifically on things we can do here in San Francisco and in California to improve opportunities for disadvantaged youth. But I'm going to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is a complicated concept that means different things to different people. But I want to distill it to a simple statistic that we can measure systematically in the data. The probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap all the way to the top fifth of the income distribution. So think of that as the classic Horatio Alger version of the American dream. How common is that in the United States versus other developed countries around the world where we have similar data? In the US, children who are born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution have a 7.5% chance of making it to the top fifth. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, sometimes when people see these statistics, they react by saying, oh, even in Canada, it looks like your odds of success aren't all that high, right? Only a 13.5% chance of succeeding. But you have to remember, of course, that no matter what you do, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%. And so the maximum value that this statistic can reach is plausibly 20%. That is to say, if we lived in a society where your parents played no role at all in determining your outcomes, we'd expect to see 20% of kids move from the bottom fifth to the top fifth. So that's kind of the upper bound that you would expect this statistic to take. And so relative to that benchmark, these are actually quite large differences in rates of upward mobility across countries. One way I think about it is that your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada rather than the United States. Now, these differences across countries have attracted a lot of public attention and a lot of concern, generated a lot of concern that the US may no longer be a land of opportunity, contrary to its traditional perception. But what I'm going to focus on today is that upward mobility varies even more within the United States. And I think that's actually something we can learn much more from than these broad comparisons across countries. In recent work with my colleagues, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the United States. And we do that by using anonymous data from tax and Social Security records on 10 million kids born between 1980 and 1982. So basically all children born in America between 1980 and 1982. Now, this work that I'm going to show you is an example of a broader trend in social science towards the use of big data to answer important economic and social questions. And so I think that's one of the most profound trends in our field. It's transforming not just the question I'm going to discuss today, but a variety of other problems. Much as you hear about big data being used in the private sector, companies like Amazon and Google using huge data sets to offer better products, likewise, our vision is that you can use these data to answer social questions and provide better evidence to policymakers to make better decisions that will improve people's lives. So what we do here is rank children and parents in the national income distribution, and we assign children to locations based on where they grew up, and we use that data to draw this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what this map is plotting is the same statistic that I started out with, the fraction of children who start out in the bottom fifth of the national distribution and make it to the top fifth. The map is colored so that lighter colored areas represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So there are 740 areas in this map. So one of them, for example, is the Bay Area, represented here by San Jose, and likewise all of the other metro and rural areas in the US. And what you can see if you look at the scale is that there's an incredibly broad spectrum in terms of rates of upward mobility within the United States. In some places, rates of upward mobility, like in the middle of the country, exceed 16%, higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark and for Canada. At the other end of the spectrum, if you look at places like Atlanta and Charlotte, the numbers are below 4.5%, lower than any country for which we currently have data. So even within America, there's this incredibly broad spectrum in children's chances of escaping poverty and achieving the American dream. Now, in this large map, your eye gravitates towards the broad regional variation, right? The much higher rates of mobility in the Midwest than in the Southeast, the relatively high rates of mobility, upward mobility in the West Coast and much of the Northeast. But it turns out if you zoom in further, and now let's take a look at the data here within the Bay Area, there's a lot of variation even across counties within a community or even across relatively nearby neighborhoods. So if we look at the data for the Bay Area here, again, looking at the same statistic, what fraction of kids make it to the top, starting at the bottom, we see a remarkable amount of variation across counties in the Bay Area, where for kids growing up in the 1980s, a remarkable 18% of kids growing up in San Francisco or San Mateo made it to the top 20%. Now remember, relative to that benchmark of 20% perfect mobility, this is really an incredibly high rate of success. In contrast, if you go across the Bay Bridge to Oakland, that number falls nearly by a factor of 2 to 11.4%. So even within relatively narrow geographies, we see really sharp differences in the rate at which kids achieve the American dream. So naturally, the question of interest to us as researchers and to policymakers is to ask why upward mobility varies so much across areas and what ultimately we might be able to do from a policy perspective to improve rates of upward mobility more broadly. There are two very different explanations for the variation in children's outcomes across areas that we're seeing in these maps. The first is that there's heterogeneity. That is, different people live in different places. Maybe the types of people who live in Atlanta are just different from the types of people who live in Iowa. We know that that's true at some level. And maybe this is not really so much about different places, but rather about different people in different places. The second possibility is what sociologists and economists call neighborhood effects. The idea that places have a causal effect on upward mobility for a given person. That is, if I take a given child and put that child in San Francisco instead of Oakland, or in the Bay Area instead of Atlanta, I'm going to see really different outcomes for that given child. There's been a lot of work over the past 30 years or so in sociology and economics to try to distinguish between these two very different explanations. But that work has been quite controversial and somewhat inconclusive. Recently, thanks to big data, modern data sets were able to discriminate between these explanations much more precisely. So let me explain how we do that by stepping back and first asking, what is the ideal experiment that you would run to test whether where you grow up really matters, really affects how you do in the long term? So the ideal experiment you would run would be to randomly assign children to neighborhoods and compare their outcomes in adulthood. So if you were thinking about this from a scientific perspective, you'd like to randomly assign kids to each of those 740 areas I showed you on the map and compare how they do in adulthood depending upon where they grew up. So naturally, it's very difficult to run an experiment like that in practice, right? And that's, I think, the key challenge in social science, that we're not able to run experiments as scientists are typically able to do. So instead, what we do is approximate that experiment using what I'll call a quasi-experimental design. We study 5 million families who move across areas in observational data that we have from tax and social security records. And the key idea of our approach is to exploit variation in the age of the child when the family moves in order to identify the causal effect of environment. So let me show you how this works with a simple example rather than going into the statistical details. So let's take a set of families that start out in Oakland. And to make things concrete, suppose if you grow up from birth in Oakland, you earn $30,000 on average when we measure your income at, say, age 30. And now consider a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco, which, as we saw in the map, seems to produce better outcomes for kids in low-income families. So let's say, to pick a number again, if you grow up in a low-income family in San Francisco, when you're 30 years old, you earn $40,000 on average. So now what I want to do is take a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco with kids of different ages. And let's start by looking at children who move when they're exactly 9 years old from Oakland to San Francisco. What we do is we track these kids who moved when they were 9 forward 21 years and measure their own earnings when they're 30 years old. And we ask, how are they doing relative to the kids who grew up in Oakland from birth and the kids who grew up in San Francisco from birth? And what we find, as you see in this dot shown here, is that they end up about halfway between the kids who grew up in Oakland from birth and the kids who grew up in San Francisco from birth. That is, they're earning roughly $35,000 when we measure their incomes as adults. So that's for the kids who moved when they're exactly 9. So now let's look at the data for kids who moved when they were 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. What you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from Oakland to San Francisco, the less of the gain you get. If you move after you're 21 or so, you get essentially no gain at all. If you move after that point as a young adult, there's absolutely no effect. So what does this chart show you? I think it has 3 very important lessons. First, it shows you that place matters. It's not just that the kids who live in Oakland are different from the kids who grew up in San Francisco. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child from Oakland to San Francisco, that child's outcomes change very significantly. That, I think, is a very encouraging message because it suggests that these differences in upward mobility are malleable. It's not just that some people have worse prospects of moving up the income ladder than others. There's actually something about the environment that can really affect children's outcomes. And this shows that we can do something about the problem potentially to improve outcomes in places like Oakland and other areas in the US. Second, you see that childhood environment really seems to be critical. If you move as an adult, it doesn't do much for you. If you move as a child, there are really significant gains from moving to a better environment. Third, you see that every extra year of childhood exposure to a better environment matters roughly equally. If you move when you're 9 instead of 10 or 15 instead of 16, each incremental year contributes to greater long-term success. That's very important, especially in light of current policy discussions about early childhood education, where there's a lot of focus on the idea that we need to invest at the very earliest years. I think those kinds of investments can be very valuable, but these data show you that there's no reason to give up on kids after they're 5 or 6 years old. If you're in a better environment, even at age 10 or even at age 15, that continues to have really substantial long-term returns. Okay, so we think that place seems to matter. That is, where you grow up really has profound effects on long-term success. So now I want to turn to think about what that means for policy. So what do we learn from that in terms of how we can go about improving upward mobility in practice? So I think there are really two different strategies that one can think about. The first is what I'll call a choice-based approach, which is to help people move to better areas. You can step back and say, look, we know in this map that some places like San Francisco, apparently, at least in the 1980s, produces better outcomes than other nearby places like Oakland. So maybe we can just help low-income families move to these brighter colored areas on the map in order to generate better outcomes. And so that's one approach that I'll talk about. Now, second, recognizing that moving people around has limits. You can't possibly move everyone out of Oakland or a city like Atlanta to a different place. You really need to think about a second set of approaches, which I'll call place-based approaches, which focus on investing in low opportunity areas in order to replicate the successes we see in areas that currently have higher levels of upward mobility. So let me talk about each of these in some more detail. So let's start with the first approach of moving to opportunity, or the choice-based approach. So one way we might go about doing this is to give low-income families subsidized housing vouchers to move to better areas. As some of you might know, the US already spends about $45 billion per year on affordable housing, but most of that affordable housing, importantly, is in low opportunity areas. So we have about 2 million families that get Section 8 housing vouchers in the US, but 80% of those vouchers are used in relatively high poverty, low opportunity areas. And so there's a real potential there, in our view, to change that program so that more families are using the money they're already getting from the government to live in some of these areas that we identify as being higher opportunity places. The second thing to note when thinking about these policies is that we're not just talking about uprooting a set of families who are happy in the area where they live and trying to force them to move somewhere else. Instead, the way I think about it is that lots of low-income families, something like 20%, already move every year. And so the way to think about these policies is when they're making that decision to move, maybe we can encourage them to move to an area that will be better for their kids in the long run, redirect where people are moving rather than getting a whole new set of people to move each year. Now, this idea of moving to opportunity is something people have thought about for some time, and in fact, there was an experiment conducted in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, which gave vouchers to families to move to better, that is, lower poverty areas using a randomized lottery. So this experiment involved about 5,000 families in 5 large cities in the United States in the mid-1990s. And the way this experiment worked can be illustrated in this map here, which focuses on the New York site of the experiment. They took a set of families that lived in the Martin Luther King Towers, a high-poverty public housing project in Harlem, and some of those families were given purely through a lottery a voucher that allowed them to move to a lower poverty area. And many of those families who got that opportunity ended up moving to a place called Wakefield in the North Bronx, which is about 10 miles away from the Martin Luther King Towers in Harlem. So basically, you can think of this experiment as asking, how do the kids who just out of pure luck got the chance to grow up in the Bronx do relative to the kids who grew up in Harlem? And in recent work with my colleagues, where we track the long-term impacts of this moving to opportunity experiment, we find that children who moved to lower poverty areas like the North Bronx when they were young, below the age of 13, for example, do much, much better as adults. They're earning 30% more, which translates to a $100,000 gain in lifetime earnings. They're 27% more likely to attend college. They're 30% less likely to become single parents. So on a broad set of outcomes, you see really substantial improvements in children's long-term success. Interestingly, moving had little effect on the outcomes of children who were already teenagers. So if you move at older ages, there was hardly any improvement. And moving had no effect on the parents' earnings. So if you think about this pattern that I'm describing on the slide, it lines up exactly with that declining pattern that I showed for people moving from Oakland to San Francisco. If you move at young ages to a better environment, you get significant gains. If you move at older ages, you don't gain all that much. And so what that data shows you is, once again, what really seems to be critical is exposure to a better neighborhood during childhood, as opposed to moving there as an adult. And that's really important in thinking about policy, because it suggests that the kinds of factors that matter are not things like the availability of jobs in an area or the conditions in the local labor market, but rather things that affect you while you're growing up. So these data illustrate that moving to opportunity can really be an effective way to improve children's outcomes. Now, there are a couple of concerns you might have about this sort of approach that policymakers often have. One is the cost of such an approach. So you might say, isn't it going to be really expensive to move all these families to better areas? Where is that money going to come from? Well, it turns out that the increase in the tax revenue from the children's higher earnings, because remember, these kids are earning about $100,000 more over their lives when they move to these better areas, that increased tax revenue actually in and of itself more than offsets the incremental costs of the program relative to keeping the families in the Martin Luther King Towers and the public housing projects. So the government actually saves money on net in the long term by having this sort of voucher program relative to traditional public housing. A second very prominent concern that comes up in the political debate, I think is an important issue here in San Francisco, for example, is that integration via decentralized housing vouchers might end up hurting the rich. So many people are worried about these kinds of policies because they say, look, I'm a person in the middle class or from a higher income family. I don't want to have people from lower income backgrounds living next to me because I'm concerned that that might increase rates of crime or affect my own kids' outcomes adversely. Now, it turns out when we look at the data that, in fact, if you look at mixed income neighborhoods where low income families are living near middle income and higher income families, if anything, the outcomes of children from rich families in those areas look better than they do in segregated neighborhoods where the rich are living separately from the poor. So there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence in the data that having more integration, having more low-income families live in proximity to high-income families actually has any negative effects on the others around them. And I think that's very encouraging in terms of generating political support for these types of policies. Okay, so that's one approach that we think concretely can work in improving our housing voucher program to provide more low-income families affordable housing in high opportunity areas. But there are, of course, limits to the scalability of such policies, right? Policies that move people can only go so far because you can't possibly, as I was saying earlier, move everyone. And so you also need to think about what types of policies can improve existing neighborhoods. The first step in identifying such policies is to understand the characteristics of areas with high levels of upward mobility. So ultimately, what you'd like to be able to do is identify the exact recipe that cities that have high levels of upward mobility are using. What exactly are places like San Francisco or Salt Lake City or much of the Midwest using to generate high levels of upward mobility, and how could you translate that to an environment like Atlanta? So we don't know exactly what that recipe is. We and many other researchers are studying that question at the moment. But what I can tell you in the meantime is a set of correlations. What types of factors really seem to be strongly associated with these differences in mobility across areas? So we've looked at a variety of factors that might correlate with differences in mobility. And I'm going to show you here, in the interest of time, the 5 strongest correlations that we've identified. The first is segregation. we find that places that are more segregated by race or by income are associated with significantly lower levels of upward mobility. Now, there are many different ways in which you can measure segregation statistically, but it turns out that the patterns are so stark here that you don't actually even need to worry about exactly how you go about measuring segregation. You can actually just see this result visually. So let me give you some examples. This map here depicts the degree of racial segregation in Atlanta. The way it's constructed is that each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot using data from the census, and the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately, regardless of how you measure it, it's clear that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city. The green dots are completely separated from the blue dots, right? The blacks and whites are living in completely different parts of the city. And what we see is that cities that, like Atlanta, have some of the lowest levels of upward mobility. Cities that are as residentially segregated as Atlanta tend to have, the 4.5% or 4% rates of moving from the bottom quintile to the top quintile. Now compare Atlanta with Sacramento, which has the same minority share as Atlanta, the same fraction of blacks and Hispanics as Atlanta. And you can see immediately that Sacramento is a much more integrated city than Atlanta, right? The dots are much more interspersed. The colors are much more interspersed. Sacramento is not perfectly integrated. There's still significant segregation even in Sacramento, but it's considerably more integrated than Atlanta. And corresponding to that, we find that cities that look like Sacramento tend to have much higher rates of upward mobility. So that's the first strong correlation we find. Higher levels of segregation are associated with lower levels of upward mobility. Now, why might that be? I think one plausible hypothesis is that this is about role model effects or differences in aspirations or exposure. So think about, if you live in a city that looks like this, you're much less likely to come into contact with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds who might show you other pathways to success that you're not aware of in your own family or among your own friends, relative to a city like this where you're much more likely to have that kind of exposure. Another potential explanation is that in a city that's more integrated, you benefit from a tax base to fund local public schools, for example, that's better than if you live in a much more segregated city. So there are many potential mechanisms for why segregation might be associated with lower levels of upward mobility. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is that's driving this relationship, but what we can say is it's a really strong, robust pattern in the data that higher levels of residential segregation are associated with lower upward mobility. And I think that's very concerning in a city like San Francisco. As we have rising housing prices here and increasing levels of segregation, we have to wonder about whether San Francisco will continue to be an area of opportunity as it was traditionally in the 1980s. Second, the second strong correlation we find is with income inequality. We find that places with a smaller middle class tend to have much lower levels of mobility. So the degree of inequality within a generation is strongly related to the extent to which people are able to move across income levels across generations, the extent of social mobility across generations. Again, this is potentially concerning as we live in a society with growing income inequality. This relationship suggests that we have to worry that children's chances of achieving the American dream of climbing up the income ladder also might deteriorate over time. The third and fourth factors come more from sociology than economics. We find very strong associations with measures of family structure. In fact, the single strongest correlation we find in the data is that areas with more single parents have significantly lower levels of upward mobility. Now, in understanding this relationship, it's very important to note that this correlation is not directly driven by the fact that children who grow up in one-parent households fare worse than children who grow up in two-parent households. And the way you can see that is that if we look at the subset of kids whose own parents are married, that is the subset of children growing up in two-parent households, if such a child lives in an area with a larger fraction of single parents, they are less likely to climb the income ladder. So even if your own parents are married, if you grow up in an area with more single parents, you have a lower probability of rising up. So that shows you again that it's not an individual level difference, it's again some community level factor that this variable is picking up. Related to that is the concept of social capital, which we also find to be very strongly associated with differences in mobility. So the way I think about social capital is the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. So the idea of social capital is how cohesive is a community? Will someone else help you out in your area even if you're not doing well? Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church is thought to be a classic example of a city with a lot of social capital, and correspondingly, it's a city with very high rates of upward mobility in our data. Now, this concept of social capital was popularized by Bob Putnam, a sociologist at Harvard, in a well-known book called Bowling Alone. And the reason for the title of Bob's book is that he used the number of bowling alleys in an area, or whether people were bowling alone in particular, as a proxy for social capital, which is a very hard thing to measure. Now, I was amazed to find in our own data that the number of bowling alleys is actually very highly correlated with these differences in upward mobility that I've been showing you. So that actually turns out to be true. But the reason I mention it here is that it also illustrates very well that everything that I'm showing you on this slide are correlations rather than causal effects. So I think it'd be pretty surprising if the policy lesson we should draw from this analysis is that we should build more bowling alleys to try to increase upward mobility in America, right? So that shows you that it's very important to distinguish correlation from causation. And so, the way you should think about these factors that I'm showing you here is that they give us hints about where to look, but they don't necessarily tell you the exact recipe for how to create success in areas that currently have low levels of mobility. The fifth and final factor that we identify, as you might expect intuitively, is the quality of public schools in an area. Places that spend more on local public schools, places that have smaller classes, places that have higher test scores tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now here, unlike with the other factors, unlike with social capital, we think there's very clear evidence that there are causal effects of improving the quality of schools rather than just correlational evidence. And so I'm going to next show you what some of that evidence looks like by talking about one specific way in which we might try to improve the quality of public schools. I'm going to talk about the impacts of teachers, drawing upon some other research that we've done in our research group. So in this case, we're using big data again to study teachers' long-term impacts. And the way we do that is by linking data for all kids who went to New York City public schools between 1989 and 2009, so that's about 2.5 million children, who've written 18 million tests over that period. We take that data and link it to the federal income tax returns that I was using for the previous analysis that I was showing you, so that we can look at things like how much kids are earning when they're 30 years old, which college they went to, whether they had a teenage birth, and so forth. So by linking these two data sets, you can ask a question like, how does the quality of your third grade teacher affect how much you're earning when you're 30 years old? Now, in order to answer that question, the first thing you need to do is define a measure of the quality of teachers that you're going to analyze, right? So if I want to show you that higher quality teachers have an impact on kids' long-term success, I have to have some way to measure the quality of teachers. Now, there are many different ways in which you might think about measuring teacher quality. I'm going to talk about one prominent measure in the current policy debate, what are called teacher value-added measures, or test score-based measures of teacher effectiveness. Now, the concept of teacher value-added, while there's some complicated statistical issues in the background, really boils down to a very simple question. We ask, how much does a teacher raise his or her students' test scores on average? So for example, if I'm a fourth grade teacher, we'd calculate my value added by taking my students' test scores on average at the end of fourth grade, minus their test scores at the beginning of fourth grade on average. And if that number was very positive, we'd say I'm a high value added teacher. And if that number is very negative, we'd say I'm a low value added teacher. Now, the question we're interested in answering is how being assigned to a high value added teacher affects children's long-term outcomes. And so once again, in studying questions like this, I find it useful to step back and ask, what's the experiment you would ideally conduct as a scientist to answer that question. So what you'd like to do here is take a set of teachers and use historical data on their students to estimate each of their value added based on the method I just described. And then you take a new batch of kids and tell their parents, look, we want to answer this really important question of whether teacher quality affects children's long-term outcomes. So we're going to run an experiment with your kids where we're going to assign some of them to teachers we've identified as being low value added and some as being high value added. And let's see how your children do in 20 years. So as you can imagine, running that experiment is extremely difficult in practice. And so now what I'm going to illustrate is how, even though we can't really run that experiment in practice, we can essentially approximate it pretty well using big data. So to describe what we do here, again, I'm going to use an example. We're going to exploit the fact that there's a lot of turnover within schools. There are lots of teachers who enter or exit a school. And so let's think about a specific school in New York City where we're going to track kids who get to 4th grade in different years. So for example, children who arrive in 4th grade in 1993, 1994, 1995, and so on. So these are different cohorts of kids. So what I'm going to do here is plot the average test score of each of these different sets of kids. And you can see that they're kind of bouncing around the median, around the 50th percentile. And then what happens at the end of the 1995 school year in this example is that a new teacher comes in who's rated in the top 5% of the value-added distribution. So we've identified this teacher based on historical data as being really excellent in terms of their value added. So let's see what happens to test scores right when that teacher comes in. You can see that immediately test scores jump up and they continue to stay high as that teacher teaches subsequent cohorts of children. Okay, so this data suggests that the entry of that high value added teacher really has significant effects on how much students learn as measured by their performance on standardized tests. Now, we all know that when we run an experiment, like from a middle school science class, you want to have a treatment group where something changes, but you also want to have a control group so that you can make sure that nothing else is contaminating your analysis, that nothing else is changing at the same time that's leading to this big jump in test scores in 4th grade. So a very natural control group in this context is to think about test scores in 3rd grade, because if the better teacher came in 4th grade, she shouldn't have any impact on how well students are doing in 3rd grade, right? And so if we plot test scores in 3rd grade over time, we see that in fact, they're totally flat around the entry of that teacher, exactly as you'd expect if the teacher is having a causal effect on children's learning. Now, in this example, I'm focusing on an excellent teacher entering the school, but this turns out to work totally symmetrically in the opposite direction. So if you have this teacher here who's in the bottom 5% of the value-added distribution and doesn't want to be there, he immediately pulls down 4th grade test scores when he starts teaching relative to the prior grade. So this works completely symmetrically across the distribution. So what these results show you is that teachers have really significant impacts on how much their students learn as measured by standardized tests. But now to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier, upward mobility, what we're ultimately interested in is not how students do on standardized tests. We're interested in their long-term outcomes. How much are they earning? Do they have a good job? Do they have a stable family situation, and so on. And so we repeat exactly the type of analysis that I've been showing you here, looking at long-term outcomes, looking at earnings, looking at college attendance, to see how, based on teachers entering and exiting, what are their effects on children's long-term performance. Let me summarize the impacts of that analysis with this hypothetical policy exercise here. So let's take the bell curve of teacher quality, and suppose we identify the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of the distribution of value added, highlighted in yellow here. Now, suppose we either train those teachers or hire a new set of teachers, letting these teachers go, such that we bring the quality of these teachers up to the average in the school district. So for instance, we let those teachers go and hire a new set of teachers who are of average quality. What would the impacts of such a policy be? Our estimates, based on the analysis that I just showed you, imply that this simple policy change of having a teacher of average quality instead of quality in the bottom 5% for a single year would increase the lifetime earnings of a child, the average child, by $50,000, which translates to an earnings gain of $1.4 million per classroom for a student of average size in the US, about 28 students. If you view that as an investment and discount that back to present value at a 5% interest rate, bring it back to money at age 10 or 12, for instance, that's worth about $250,000 of cash in hand. So you can see that teachers have incredibly large impacts on students' long-term outcomes and can really have a profound effect on upward mobility. More generally, there's other research by a number of other scholars that's shown that other aspects of schools, for instance, certain types of charter schools or the Harlem Children's Zone program, can have really significant effect on children's long-term outcomes. And so I think education, out of the 5 factors that I listed, is one area where we can really see from a concrete policy perspective that we can have important effects on upward mobility in the long run. I want to show one final set of data that approaches these issues from a different perspective, which thinks about equality of opportunity from the perspective of economic growth rather than principles of justice. So the traditional argument for greater social mobility or greater equality of opportunity that many of us come to these issues with is concern about justice, the idea that everyone should have a shot at the American dream no matter what family they're born into. But what I want to show you here is even if you set aside those concerns about justice and you're just interested in maximizing GDP, maximizing the size of the economic pie, you should still potentially be interested in improving opportunities for upward mobility. To illustrate that idea, I'm going to focus on one specific pathway to upward mobility, which is particularly relevant here in the Bay Area, which is innovation. So in order to show you this analysis, what we're going to do here is study the lives of 750,000 patent holders in the US. And the way we do that is by linking the universe of patent records to tax data so that we can track the lives of inventors and see where inventors come from and how we might be able to get more inventors in America. So let me start with this chart, which shows you patent rates versus parent income, the probability that a child goes on to become an inventor by his mid-30s or so versus his or her parents' income. So the way this chart is constructed is that on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, is the parent's household income percentile. So there are 100 dots here, one corresponding to each percentile of the distribution. And what we're plotting is the number of kids who go on to have a patent by their mid-30s in each of these 100 groups. You can see that there's an incredibly strong relationship between your parents' income and your probability of becoming an inventor. If you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times as likely to become an inventor as if you happen to be born to parents at the median of the income distribution. Now, why is there such a strong relationship between your parents' income and your probability of having a patent? One possibility is that it's the type of issues I've been talking about in this lecture, that it's about differences in childhood environment or schools or types of resources that you have access to while you're growing up. A completely different possibility is that this is about differences in ability. So maybe the children who are born to parents in the top 1%, presumably their parents had to be talented to get to the top 1% of the income distribution. And ability is transmitted genetically across generations, so maybe that's why they're more likely to become inventors, have patents themselves. So to discriminate between those two very different explanations, I'm going to turn back to that New York City test score data that I described earlier as a measure of ability early on in childhood. So this next chart here plots patent rates versus third grade math test scores. So each dot here represents 5% of the test score distribution. And you can see an interesting pattern, which is if you're below the 90th percentile of your third grade math class, you're not very likely to have a patent. And so that again shows you the strong predictive power of these early childhood test scores. But then the probability of becoming an inventor really shoots up if you're at the top of your third grade math class, which I think is intuitive in terms of how you think this might work. Now, more interestingly for the topic today, suppose we split this chart up, looking at kids from low versus high income families separately. So this chart replicates the one that I just showed you, but we're breaking kids into two groups based on their parents' income. The blue series is for kids from low and middle income families, kids who have parents below the 80th percentile of the income distribution. The red series is for kids from high income families, families that are above the 80th percentile in the top fifth of the income distribution. And what you see is a really striking pattern, which is that high ability kids, kids who are from the top 5% of their third grade math class, are much more likely to become inventors if they're from high income families. If you're from a low income family, that is in the blue series here, your odds of becoming an inventor aren't all that much higher if you're in the top 5% of your third grade math class. So to put it differently, what these data show you is that in America, you need two things in order to become an inventor. You need to be smart, as measured by your test scores, for instance, early in childhood, and you need to be from a rich family. And that, I think, gives you a very different perspective on equality of opportunity. It suggests that if we can bring more of these kids who are in the blue part of this chart, these smart kids from lower income families, if we can bring them through the innovation pathway and help them become inventors, that will not only enhance their own incomes and increase their prospects of upward mobility, it will also help the rest of us because they might end up discovering the next blockbuster drug or the next iPhone that's going to change everyone's life and increase GDP overall. So I think even setting aside concerns about justice, we should all be interested potentially in improving equality of opportunity. Now, how can we actually go about trying to get more kids from low-income families to become inventors? I'm going to show one final set of data on this, shown that ties back to the geographic variation that I started out with. So this map here shows you the origins of inventors in America. We take each of those 740 areas that I showed you before and calculate the fraction of kids who grow up in each of those areas who go on to become inventors, who go on to have a patent. And the map is colored so that the red areas are the hot spots of where inventors come from. The red areas are the places that generate more kids who go on to have patents. So you can see here a very clear pattern, which is if you grow up in an area that is a hub of innovation, for example, look at the Bay Area, that's where you see the reddest colors, the greatest number of kids who grow up to become inventors. If you grow up in the Northeast, for instance, you're also much more likely to become inventors. Another striking example, look at Texas, which in general has pretty low rates of kids going on to become inventors, with one example, with one exception, essentially right in the middle, that's Austin, Texas, growing up around, again, a university innovation hub. So that data suggests that, again, this is something about exposure. If you grow up in an innovative area, you're more likely to become an inventor yourself. What's striking is that that pattern holds even more sharply across the type of invention that you have. So inventions are classified into different technology classes, computers versus biological patents, for instance, or the specific type of computing equipment that you invent, what type of semiconductor did you develop, and so forth. And what we find is the exact area in which you become an inventor is highly influenced by the environment in which you grow up. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you take two kids who currently live in Boston. Say one of them grew up in the Bay Area, which has a lot of computer innovation, and let's say another grew up in Minneapolis, which happens to have a lot of medical device manufacturers. It turns out that if you take these two kids in Boston, the kid who grew up in Minneapolis is much more likely to have a medical device patent, and the kid who grew up in the Bay Area is much more likely to have a computer patent. That type of result holds really systematically in the data, and it gives you a little bit of insight into what might be going on in driving that big gap in innovation between low-income and high-income kids. Kids from high-income families are exposed to lots of different opportunities, through their parents or through their networks, through their neighborhoods, internships, science programs, and so forth. Kids from lower-income backgrounds typically don't have any of those exposures. And the importance of exposure, as seen in this map, suggests that that can be a critical pathway in generating this big gap in innovation by socioeconomic status. It also suggests that if we can increase opportunities for exposure for kids from lower income backgrounds through targeted internship programs or outreach by Silicon Valley companies, for example, that can really have a profound effect on those kids' lives and on aggregate levels of innovation more generally. So let me conclude by talking about some policy lessons that emerge from this body of work. The first lesson, I think, is while we often talk about issues of inequality in the American dream at a national level, we should really be thinking about tackling upward mobility at a local level, both by investing in improving opportunity in areas that currently offer less upward mobility, cities like Atlanta or Baltimore or places like Oakland, for instance, but also by helping low-income families with young children move to higher opportunity areas. And in particular, I think we should be focusing on encouraging moves to areas that one might call opportunity bargains, which is something we're focusing on in our current research. So to illustrate how this works, let me show you this chart here, which shows some preliminary data for New York, where we're constructing these measures of opportunity for every zip code in New York. So on the y-axis is an opportunity index, the effect on a child's earnings of growing up in a given zip code. So at the top, if you grow up in that zip code, you earn 20% more than the average place. And if you at the places at the very bottom, like the Martin Luther King Towers that we talked about earlier, you lose 20% relative to growing up in an average place. We're plotting that data on opportunity versus the average monthly rent in the zip code. So as you might expect intuitively, the places that offer better opportunities for kids tend to be more expensive. So to take one example, Park Slope, which is where Mayor de Blasio used to live, is a very expensive part of New York, and kids do quite well there. But interestingly, it turns out that there are a lot of opportunity bargains to be found. So take a look, for instance, at Rockaway Park or East Midwood, other neighborhoods in New York. They offer almost the same level of opportunity as judged by our data as Park Slope, but they cost about half as much as living in Park Slope. And so by focusing on these opportunity bargains and helping families with housing vouchers move to those areas, which is a project we're currently working on a large scale with the Housing and Urban Development Agency and various public housing authorities, we think we can really improve the prospects of kids from low-income families. So that's the first broad lesson, I think local. We can actually all make a difference in our own local communities on these important problems. The second lesson is that we should focus, I think, on improving childhood environments, because that really seems to be the critical driver of these differences in opportunity. This is not just about spending more money. So often I think economists think if we have a problem like schools that are not of good quality, we should increase funding for schools. So obviously money can be helpful, but it's important to note that the US already spends more on schools than many other countries, for example, Finland or other Scandinavian countries that have much better outcomes. So instead, my view is that we should focus on key inputs like improving the quality of teachers or expanding certain high-performance charter schools. Think about how we can spend the money we're already spending more smartly rather than just increasing the total budget, which is difficult in a time of tight government budget constraints. And finally, I think at the broadest level, as I hope I've illustrated here, harnessing big data to develop a scientific evidence base for economic and social policy can be quite valuable. So all of the statistics that I've been talking about today are publicly available on a website called equalityofopportunity.org, which any of you can go look at and use for follow-up research projects or to study how your own community is doing. And our hope is by constructing data like this, local mayors and cities and other interested advocates will be able to monitor trends in mobility and study which policies work, not just in improving opportunity in cities that currently don't look so good, but also, I would stress, in maintaining opportunity in places like the Bay Area, which in the 1980s looked really good in terms of rates of upward mobility. That's what we saw in the maps that I was showing you. But it's not clear that that will be the case for the current generation. And so I want to end on that point. So many people ask, how does the Bay Area look for the current generation of kids in terms of upward mobility? It's difficult to answer that question directly, right? Because we're not going to see the earnings of kids who are currently growing up in the Bay Area for another 20 years or so, until they start working. However, one thing that you can do, which was an exercise that was done by journalists at The Atlantic magazine in an interesting article recently using our data, is to ask, what would you predict upward mobility will look like in the Bay Area based on how those 5 key factors that I described are trending in this community. So things like segregation, income inequality, levels of social capital, the quality of schools. We can measure all of those things using current data, not data from the 1980s, but data from the past few years. And you can ask, given how things are changing in the Bay Area, how would you expect upward mobility to look for the current generation of kids? And the answer that they reached is summarized by the title of this article, which is "The Place Where the Poor Once Thrived," which is what they call the Bay Area. They point out that because the Bay Area has increasing segregation, higher levels of income inequality, potentially declining quality of public schools, all of these factors suggest that for the current generation of kids, the Bay Area is no longer going to be a land of opportunity. And I think that's very worrisome and shows that all of us should be thinking seriously about these problems, even in an area that traditionally was really a land of opportunity. And so I think the tools that we've identified here and hope to identify in ongoing research will hopefully point to additional directions through which we can revive the American dream. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Chetty. You gave us many things to think about here. At this point, we'll take some questions and answer them. I think Dr. Kakar has set it up so that there's 2 microphones. So if you have questions, if you could give them, they're on the mic, then we'll be able to do this. Thank you.
I was wondering on the map of Sacramento, if you were to do an overlay of income instead of race, what that map of Sacramento would look like.
Yeah, very good question. So if you were, to look at segregation by income instead of segregation by race, what are the patterns? The reason I showed you segregation by race there is that segregation by income actually looks quite similar. So cities that are very segregated by race tend to be very segregated by income as well. That's not one-for-one true in every single city, but there's a very strong association between those 2 things. So Atlanta is much more segregated both by income. Low-income people in Atlanta live in very different parts of the city than high-income people, than Sacramento, where there are more mixed-income neighborhoods. It's a little bit harder to measure income segregation than racial segregation, which is why people focus on racial segregation measures, but you see very similar patterns when you have the data.
Still be very curious.
So my question is, you focused a lot on the availability of opportunity as the measure for mobility, and there seems to be a lot in the news lately about the availability of opportunity for millennials and their ability to achieve that opportunity, particularly in the housing market. So I'm curious if there's any insights in the data about how the availability of opportunity has actually trended across different generations.
Yeah. So as best we can tell, and the data are somewhat limited here historically, because we don't have the type of huge data sets that we're using here with millions of kids going far back in time. But as best we can tell, in many places, the availability of opportunity is falling over time, as this article kind of suggests, right? That you have growing segregation, you have growing inequality, the various factors that I was talking about suggest that we're going to have declining levels of opportunity for the current generation and subsequent generations. And as a result, you're going to have more chronic persistence of poverty across generations. And so that's why I think it's important to think hard about what types of levers can be used to push in the opposite direction. As we have growing segregation, how can we create more affordable housing so we have mixed income neighborhoods? If we think that community colleges and state colleges can play a big role in upward mobility, how can we preserve those institutions so that kids of the next generation continue to have the same opportunities? So I think the trends are not necessarily in a good direction, but one shouldn't lose hope because there are things one can do to stem that trend.
Thank you.
This is more of a follow-up to the speaker before me on this side. Since you mentioned before that segregation and social status has a large factor in terms of how far one can move socially. And then you mentioned how teachers like you recommend putting teachers into multiple neighborhoods, but and I've been told in multiple sociology classes that you are most likely going to be in the same social class as your parents, which is consistent with what you've been saying. And you've also said that you would recommend like spreading teachers around. And to follow up with that, how would you, since you would say to like improve teacher quality all around, how exactly would you do that? Would you prefer putting teachers in, say, a neighborhood that's like less segregated, which you say has more chance of social mobility, or would you prefer like just putting in a place with minimal, like high segregation but minimal social mobility?
Yeah.
Like, what would you think is best in this?
Good question. I mean, I think, I think there are a couple of elements of your question. So first, how can you improve the quality of the teaching workforce in the U.S., both in segregated and, less segregated areas? How do you go about doing that? So I think one of the ways to think about the problem is that teaching is not a profession in America that many people aspire to go into. I think the way it's structured, despite its importance, is not ideally suited towards drawing and retaining the most talented people who I think really should be going into teaching, given the profound effects that teaching has on so many people. And so I think part of that has to do with salaries, part of that has to do with prestige. So if you look at countries like Finland that have the best education systems, what you hear is a child who's doing really well in school in Finland, their aspiration is to become a teacher because that's really viewed as like the best job you can get. And that's not the case in most American cities, and I think that's something we really need to fix. Now, if you have a good set of teachers, do you want to put them in the most segregated areas or the less segregated areas? That's a difficult question to answer. My instinct would be you want to try to improve conditions in the places where we have the biggest challenges. So in these cities with very high levels of concentrated poverty, which often have the schools that are struggling the most, I think having effective teachers, which is what, for instance, the Teach for America program tries to do, can be really effective. I think the challenge with Teach for America is we have excellent teachers in the classroom for a couple of years, but they don't end up staying for many years. And that is what we need. We need teachers who continue to want to stay in these high poverty urban schools so that they can help kids do well in the long run. So that's where I would try to emphasize improvements in teacher quality.
So you mentioned, it's quite similar to his question, but you mentioned like early childhood education is very essential for adulthood success and for mobility around the housing area. So I think Milton Friedman once proposed a voucher school program which was failed to put in practice in the States. Would you think would be a better to policy that would be potential to propose in the future that can ensure the equality of the education?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think early childhood education can be very valuable, but these data show that improving children's environment, not just in the earliest years in childhood, but throughout childhood and even in the college years, can be very valuable. And so I think providing greater access to high quality education and high quality childhood environments, it's not, I think, purely about education, it's also about where you live. If you live in an area where the people around you are involved in crime or you don't see a lot of opportunity, I think that can really influence a child's perceptions and influence their long-term outcomes. So I don't think it's just about tax credits or specific investments purely at the early childhood level. I think it's a broader shift that's required in environment and education throughout childhood. How you'd go about doing that, I think, comes back to questions like how do you improve the quality of teachers? How do you design more integrated neighborhoods? How can you create more affordable housing so that you don't have some people living in one part of the city and other people living in different parts? So I think I would take a solution that has many different elements rather than one single tax credit or try to tackle the problem in one specific way.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful lecture. It's really fascinating. I really gained a lot. My name is Chen. I'm an econ grad student here, and I'm also an international student. So I came to San Francisco 3 years ago, and because of the more opportunities here and a better education level. So and you're talking about the upper mobility at local level and national level. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think about upper mobility at an international level?
And so do you mean at an international level in terms of immigrants, or do you mean, how does upward mobility compare in the US to other countries?
Probably more like immigrants or
Yeah.
internationals and how they like perform better
Yeah.
before here.
I mean, that's a great question. I think another important aspect of the American dream that attracts a lot of people to this country, including my own parents, is the idea that you can have much greater opportunities as an immigrant here than elsewhere. It's difficult for us to study that directly in the data because what we're doing is comparing kids' incomes to their parents' incomes, and we can't see parents' incomes if the parents are not in the United States, right? Naturally, in the tax data that we're using, we only see parents' incomes if the parents are also in the US. So actually in the analysis that I was showing you, for that reason, we restrict the sample to US citizens. So everything I was showing you was for citizens, but my intuition, this is not based on data, but just my instinct, is that you'd see very similar patterns for immigrants. So I think immigrants who come to the United States, do so rightly, at least traditionally, because the US really does offer great opportunities relative to other countries. There are other studies, for instance, that can track immigrants better using Swedish data, for example. Sweden also has a lot of immigrants, showing that immigrants who come to Sweden do dramatically better, particularly if they get there at younger ages. And so I think all of these issues likely apply to immigrants in the same way that we were talking about here. It's just that we can't directly analyze immigrants in the data we have so far.
So in your earlier slides, you were showing that, actually, I have notes. You were showing that the numbers, I was assuming the numbers were based off of pure income?
Yes.
So you were showing that if you, say, grew up in Oakland and then at some point moved to San Francisco, and would you then be staying in San Francisco for the lifetime of the data?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Because the thought I had was incomes are different in different areas, but also cost of living is different.
Good question. Absolutely. Cost of living could matter. It's important to note that when we talk about children's locations, we're talking about their location where they grow up, which is not necessarily the location where they're living in adulthood. So, if you grew up in Oakland or San Francisco, certainly within the Bay Area, people move around a fair bit. But more generally, take like the center of the country where we saw really high rates of upward mobility for kids who grew up in Iowa, for instance. The kids who are really succeeding in Iowa, lots of those kids are living in Chicago or New York when we're measuring their incomes in adulthood, right? Because lots of the most successful kids end up moving elsewhere to get that higher paying job. And so I think that actually illustrates a really interesting pattern in places like Iowa, which is that they are extremely good in terms of rates of upward mobility, despite having kind of a brain drain problem, where the most talented, successful people are constantly moving out, new people are moving in, yet they continue to generate these fantastic outcomes. So figuring out what's going on in those places, I think is really important for exactly that reason. But yeah, I think it's not just driven by local differences in cost of living, because this is about where you grow up, not where you're working in adulthood. Please.
So you mentioned a couple ways to improve people's social mobility aspects by either moving them or investing in the neighborhood. How would moving them to a place like San Francisco even work? Because in your example, we talked about Harlem to Bronx, and real estate, gas prices, grocery prices are not even the same when we look at San Francisco. So how would the voucher system work here?
Right. So affordability is clearly an issue. I think that's why it comes back to this slide that I was showing here, where you've got to think about not moving people to the most expensive parts of San Francisco or New York, moving people to Park Slope, which is not practical, but rather identifying what we're calling these opportunity bargains, places that would be affordable to families with housing vouchers, even though vouchers are never going to cover the full cost of an apartment in a prime part of San Francisco. So I think San Francisco is a particularly challenging example because for most of the city, it's not really plausible that a family with a voucher would be able to rent here. there are outlying areas maybe where you'd see, bargains like this where you have pretty good outcomes for kids that are more affordable. One of the things we're hoping to do with this very large data is identify precisely what are those places where families with vouchers can move that are kind of these hidden gems, right? So everyone knows that if you move to the place with the best school district, and near San Francisco, it's great for kids and it's a great place to live, but it's also totally unaffordable. So that's not all that useful, exactly as you say. But identifying these bargains, I think, is really where we can make a difference. And my view is, given that we already spend about $40 billion on programs like this, we might as well use that money more effectively to try to help families get to those areas. So I think moving is by no means the only solution, but given our current policy framework, it's something we should be thinking about doing more intelligently.
Hi, you alluded to social capital as a really important factor and also to the difficulty of measuring it. I was wondering if among your colleagues or in the literature, if you've kind of seen any promising ways that you might actually kind of solve that problem and measure it. And particularly, I was kind of thinking about in this era we live in, like public social media data, right? All these things about someone has a network, these people are their friends, et cetera.
Excellent question, and you've anticipated exactly the path we're pursuing to try to study that question more carefully, which is to use data on networks. So we're starting a collaboration with Facebook to understand the role of networks in social mobility more directly, and our sense is networks might give us greater insight at a more granular level into exactly how the social capital or role model peer effects are working in practice. So the logic of the project where we're starting is to say, take a city like Atlanta versus San Francisco. Does the structure of the friendship network in Atlanta look very different than the structure of the friendship network in the Bay Area or in Salt Lake City, places that have higher levels of mobility? In particular, do you see more low-income kids having friends from higher income backgrounds? And is that integration in terms of, across social groups, does that seem to be a key mediator of children's later success? We're also interested in understanding the determinants of networks and social capital using these data. So one of the hypotheses, if you think back to the moving to opportunity experiment that I described, where the kids who moved at young ages from Harlem to the Bronx did much better than the kids who moved at older ages, one prominent hypothesis for that is that the kids who moved at older ages didn't really change their friendship network or their social group at all. They basically took the subway back to Harlem and hung out with their old friends, and nothing really changed. So we'll be able to test that directly by using Facebook data today to see whether the friendship networks of the kids who move at young ages versus older ages look very different. So that's, gives you a sense of how we're trying to dig into these issues with modern data more precisely.
Hi there, good evening. Thanks a lot for giving your talk tonight. I was just wondering, unfortunately, the wealthy do have a lot more decision-making power than the poor, and as you mentioned, they do have a concern with mixed neighborhood housing vouchers that they might lose their slice of the pie. And you mentioned that it may, in fact, be more beneficial for the wealthy as well. I can totally understand how that may be the case intuitively. I'm wondering how you came to that conclusion. Was it intuitive, or did that bear itself out in the data as well?
Yep.
Thank you.
So yes, so we reached that conclusion empirically in the data in the following way. So the maps that I was showing you were focused on kids from low-income families, right? And what did their outcomes look like based on where they grew up? So we can analogously draw the same type of map for kids growing up in high-income families. Can say how well do high-income kids in Atlanta do, and how well do high-income kids in San Francisco do, et cetera, right? And so, as I pointed out, if you're in a more mixed income area, we see the kids from the low-income families doing better. Analogously, now if we look at the data for the kids growing up in high-income families, we see that they don't do any worse in those areas. If anything, they do slightly better. So in practice, when you look at the data, it is not true empirically that in more mixed income areas, you see children from higher income families doing worse. Now, that doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that if we have some radical policy change that completely shifts the structure of cities, we could get very different outcomes. But the data we have don't point in the direction that higher income families should be incredibly concerned that their kids are going to do much worse if we have more integrated neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for coming here. I learned a lot tonight. My question is regarding, you're mentioning that there are two main ways to change people's mobility. One is to move them, and one is to improve neighborhoods. Regarding the initiative of improving neighborhoods, my question is, what's the best way to improve a neighborhood but keep it affordable for the people living there? And my reasoning is that if the neighborhood is improved, then the demand for that neighborhood goes up, and more people want to move there.
Yeah.
And so how do we address that problem?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, your question gets to key issues of gentrification and how, when you improve a given area, how do you maintain opportunity, maintain affordability for the families that are already there? I don't have, a concrete answer to that beyond saying that, again, if we have more integrated neighborhoods where you have zoning laws. So take the example of zoning, which I think illustrates this concretely. Some communities that have excellent schools, for example, impose things like minimum lot size requirements that basically serve to keep out lower income families that don't want to have the 1 acre of land, and can't afford that. And so those types of laws serve to increase segregation and create, and make it hard for lower income families to benefit from things like better public schools. So as you improve the quality of public schools, if you retain the option to have lower income, high density housing in a given area, for instance, by not allowing zoning laws that prevent the building of such property, then I think you can potentially continue to maintain affordability and opportunity. So I think one has to, again, think about a combination of different policy changes while you're changing the school system, thinking about zoning laws at the same time to tackle problems like the one you described.
I just have a follow-up. So I believe that there's a policy in San Francisco where for every square footage of luxury housing built, I believe that the developer is responsible for at least partially subsidizing some kind of lower income housing project. So is that something that is a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key challenges San Francisco faces in particular, we just had a forum this morning at Stanford on housing policy in the Bay Area, and the big challenge in the Bay Area is just purely on the supply side. There are insufficient housing units in the Bay Area given the tremendous job growth here, and that's what's driving up house prices so much. And so I think things like credits for developers to build affordable housing can be helpful, but it's also very important that the city actually permit more building. So at the end of the day, there are regulations in San Francisco that basically prevent builders from building any kind of housing in great quantities. Restrictions on how tall buildings can be and how many new permits can be issued and things like that. And so I think it's very important to think not just about subsidies, but just allowing more building in a city where there's so much job growth is critical, I think.
Thank you very much.
So one last question, Joel.
Thank you again for the lecture. It was amazing. Hopefully I can close this out with a twofer question. One is a methodology question. Yeah. In the part of your presentation in the data where you looked at the movement from city to city, from a low probability to a high probability of mobility city, were you able to control for some of the factors that you identified as being correlated with high mobility cities between those cities? So when you looked at one city and they may have had the same integration factor, so that's the first question. Yeah. The other is to get your thoughts on the use of big data. Obviously, this whole area and your whole study is based on the use of big data and the analysis. There's kind of the dark side of the force possibility of using big data in many areas where the algorithms that are used develop profiles on people that are used for credit scores, that are used for profiling for criminal activity, et cetera. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the use of data and how it should be used and how particular algorithms that impact people's lives and their potential upward mobility should be used in society.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great questions. So on the first question, we didn't think about approaching the movers analysis exactly in that way because what we were kind of interested in understanding is if you move, let's say, from a more segregated area to a more integrated area, what are the effects on your own children's outcomes, right? So your question is, if we take two places with the same level of segregation, same level of all of these other factors, what ends up happening if a child moves from what still appears to be a better area or a worse area? It's an interesting idea. We haven't looked at that directly. One thing that I can tell you is the amount of variation across these areas, once you control for those factors, actually becomes quite small. That is, those 5 factors explain, more than 85% of the variance in outcomes across areas. So the vast majority of the story here is really in those 5 factors, not in the part that's left. And so that's the reason we didn't think about controlling for those factors so much as understanding what happens when you move to a place that looks different on those 5 dimensions. On your second question on big data, big data is, all the talk, as you all know, both in academia and in the private sector at Stanford. There are all kinds of courses on big data, new methods being developed, and so forth. I think you highlight an important trade-off in the use of big data. I think in everything that I've been showing you, this is not so much about an individual person, right? I was showing you data aggregating over thousands, if not millions of people to understand aggregate patterns, stories that we could draw out that matter for all of us, not so much singling out and profiling any one person. And so I think the use of big data in the private sector sometimes goes in a very different direction of really trying to figure out how we can market things in a better way or screen people for jobs and things like that. And I agree with you. Some of those approaches can actually have a pernicious negative effect precisely for the reasons that I've been talking about here. They could potentially lead to further discrimination or basically further separation across groups that exacerbate some of these problems of inequality and a lack of opportunity for certain groups. So I think like any other tool, you can't view big data as just a panacea that's going to improve things universally. I think it's about how you use that tool. Do you use it to try to do better things? I think one of the very important uses of these data can be to implement better social and economic policy. My view is that we're spending billions, if not trillions of dollars on government programs to try to combat problems like poverty, increase opportunity, and so forth. But we're doing that with incredibly limited evidence. When you step back and think about it from like a scientific perspective, it's incredible how little evidence we have on what actually works relative to the amount of money we spend on these problems. And to me, that's really the potential of big data, to shed light on what actually works and what doesn't. And I think if we can use big data in that way, we can all benefit greatly from it, despite the concerns one might have about confidentiality and profiling and so forth, which I think if handled in the right way, can be addressed while still reaping the benefits of this data in terms of knowledge.
I want to thank Professor Chetty again, one of our Economics Association students. Esteban is going to give us a token thing. In Asian cultures, you always have to have a gift, so we're going to leave you with this one gift. To the audience, thank you very much. Have a good evening and a safe trip home.